All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Augmented Intelligence Workshop. Today we have two excellent speakers, Suparna Rajaram talking about collective memory and Amit Goldenberg talking about collective emotion. So as you can anticipate, these talks might overlap. And before we dive right in, I wanted to make a short announcement that given that we saw how many great and brilliant ideas you post in the Zoom chat, we decided that we might try to save it and share it with other members of the workshop through Slack channel. So I hope it doesn't prevent you from posting more and more of your great ideas there and references, and we'll see how it works. Great. Suparna, do you want to take the stage?
How does it look for the screen? Okay, excellent. Thank you, Marina. I just want to say at the beginning that I will be looking at a different screen as I'm presenting. So my face will be turned away from my camera. So just anticipate that. And I'll also not be looking at the chat, so I won't know what's being posted there. So hopefully you'll bring the questions back at a later point. Okay, so I want to begin by first thanking the organizers for inviting me to this fascinating workshop. I've really enjoyed the previous talks, and I'm very excited to share the thrust of my group's work with all of you today. So what I want to do is to talk about social transmission of memory and how this process changes individual and collective memories, particularly from a cognitive perspective. So that's the approach my group takes in asking questions on this topic. And we mainly use experimental methodology to assess these mnemonic consequences. So what I want to do today, this is kind of a roadmap for what I hope to accomplish. First, I want to show you how we measure remembering with others in the lab using this type of cognitive experimental paradigm. I'll talk about two instances in that context about setting up experiments to see who talks to whom and what consequences that has on memory, and who knows what in those groups. And what consequences that has. So a lot of this work in this area has focused on what we remember as we work in groups. So this is with reference to the contents of memory. So true memories, that is accuracy, distorted memories, and false memories. And of course, unique and collective memories, which will be a part of my talk. What I also want to talk about is not just the content of memory, but also how we organize these memories. So I'm going to also focus on memory structures. Looking at what we remember and how these memories are organized have consequences for how individual memory representations change and how collective memory emerges in groups. But the structure of individual memory has shown us, the research on this area has shown us that this also has consequences for how we retrieve the past and how we learn in the future. So by implications, this means how others can influence how we retrieve the past and how we learn information in the future. In general, as we all know, social transmission of memory has broader consequences in terms of what we remember and what information we transmit. This process has been associated with formation of beliefs. It's shaping our actions, even health consequences in terms of our friends influencing behaviors such as smoking and even weight gain. And of course, with reference to individual and collective identity of groups. So in that context, I want to share with you what a study from a cognitive perspective can inform us with respect to the formation of these individual and collective memories in response to social influences. So in cognitive research, an interest in social influences of memory can be traced back to Bartlett, who emphasized the importance of studying the social context in which people remember the past. But in parallel, in over a century of memory research and cognition, Ebbinghaus's approach advocating strict experimental control really became influential. And this approach led to researchers focusing on individual memory ability. And this body of work has generated several underlying principles and theories that have been very robust and influential. And to answer the questions about the process of memory convergence from this perspective, I leverage these theoretical and empirical advances from this body of work and examine how the cognitive constituents operating at the individual level shape collaborative remembering and memory of the collective. So this kind of provides the framework to you about where I'm coming from and what sorts of mechanisms I am interested in investigating. So our basic lab research aims to identify how social remembering, or what I will call collaborative remembering, influences memory, both during the collaboration stage and afterwards, when people are no longer working with others. So how does remembering change memory? A popular belief, of course, is that two heads are better than one, so remembering with others should make the product better. Well, that turns out not to be true. So the prototypical paradigm goes like this. Let's say 6 participants come into the lab. Each one is exposed to some study information while they work alone. So this would be a list of words, for example. And in general, they're placed in small groups, typically composed of 3 strangers, where they work together to remember this information. So let's say this is the list of information that this group produces. Of course, this information is better than what a single individual would produce, but to assess the impact of collaboration, comparison is made with a control group called the nominal group, and I'll refer to this nominal group frequently, which is a group in name only, because here 3 individuals work alone and their product is pooled in a non-redundant fashion, removing overlapping items and coming up with the group product. And as you can see here, what happens is not that the collaborative group actually does better. So to take an actual example from one of our experiments, I've extracted 2 relevant conditions here. And this design and procedure is sort of typical of the remaining experiments that I will be presenting. And I'll also note sample sizes in some cases, so you can get a flavor for the kind of samples needed to get sufficient power in these studies. So after studying, say, a list of words while working alone, in the initial recall, there's a nominal group and a collaborative group, and in the collaborative group, people are engaging in free-flowing exchange of information to come up with their group product. After this phase, there's a post-collaborative stage where everyone's recalling information alone. And this phase is very critical for what I'll be presenting, because here we can get the impact on both individual memory as well as collective memory as a consequence of having collaborated compared to not having collaborated. So when collaboration takes place, contrary to intuition, people actually recall less when working in groups than working alone, a phenomenon called collaborative inhibition in recall. So why do they recall less? It's not because people simply leave the job to others, that is exhibiting diffusion of responsibility, because prior work has ruled out this possibility empirically. Rather, people recall less because when listening to others' memories, their own preferred recall sequence is disrupted. We know that the sequence in which people recall information can be idiosyncratic to each individual, because each of us has a different learning experience in life that shapes the architecture of our memory in different ways, despite many similarities. So disruption during recall lowers each group member's memory output, thereby lowering the collaborative group recall's output. So this recall loss is both temporary and it also has far-reaching consequences. People recover some of these memories later, but other memories get inhibited and are functionally forgotten. So why does it feel as if remembering with others improves memory? One of the many answers for that is what is called effect of re-exposure or memory contagion. Re-exposure is the process where while listening to group members, I might hear a piece of information that I had forgotten. And this re-exposes me to that information and increases the likelihood that I will remember more later because of collaboration. So as you can see here, after the first recall, when all participants recall the studied information now working alone, those who collaborated earlier now recall more than those who did not collaborate, thus memories change through augmentation. So in addition, as I had noted earlier, after the disruptive influences of others is removed during the recall, people do recover memories that they failed to report during collaboration, and this rebounding also improves recall. Finally, there's memory contagion, a process that's similar to re-exposure, but it usually refers to incorporating into one's memory incorrect information that others erroneously reported. So this information was never a part of the original experience, but it's falsely introduced by someone during collaboration. So memories change through such social contagion also. So taken together, collaborative remembering can lead to opposing cognitive consequences on later memory, disruption, forgetting, memory contagion on the one hand, processes that impair or distort memory, and rebounding and accurate re-exposure on the other, processes that enhance memory. So in this first article, we introduced a framework that we have since updated to map these mechanisms and a number of other cognitive mechanisms that I've listed here on the left that come into play when people learn or remember information together. So here is a framework that kind of provides a flow of this sequence that I have just described to you. So it kind of brings together in a summary, individuals come to a learning situation with pre-existing memory structures that they've acquired through their prior life experiences. These structures guide learning and establishing of idiosyncratic memory organization. And then during collaboration, these organizations sort of come together or come in conflict, and a number of different cognitive mechanisms become activated, leading to an influence that they exert on final individual recall. Now, this final individual recall of those who were earlier in the same group then is taken into account to compute the overlapping content across the memories of these individuals to arrive at a measure of collective memory within this framework. So I now turn to situations where people collaborate not just with the same partners across recall situations, but with different partners, which is a common scenario for how we share and transmit information in our social groups. So in the first instance, this is a standard collaborative recall situation that I've already described to you. And in the identical groups, the same group will collaborate together twice. So the collaboration becomes insular with the same partners. However, here, this yellow participant, for example, now collaborates with two different partners who did also earlier collaborate with other partners. So in diverse groups, what we have is that the number of partners in a single collaboration remains constant. Number of opportunities to collaborate are also constant. But the number of partners with whom one collaborates increases in this diverse network, and thereby exerting the influence of both proximal partners with whom one directly collaborated, as well as distal partners who were your partners' partners and can thus exert indirect influence. So this is kind of a laboratory model of getting this network influence. So again, the experiment runs in the similar way that I've already described to you. There's the nominal group providing the baseline. After study, there are three recall sequence of three recalls. In the identical groups, the same group collaborates twice. In the reconfigured group, the group changes. And then finally, we have the third recall, which is critical for computing post-collaborative memory at the individual level, and then calculating the overlap of these three individuals here to compute collective memory. And here are the results. we obtain the standard collaborative inhibition when the group is identical. And in the first recall, it's all the same, whether it's whichever condition we are looking at, this collaborative inhibition. But in the second recall, when group members change, collaborative inhibition is eliminated because now there's so much more exposure to information that can offset the information that's lost. So the groups are actually doing better because they're working with different people. What about collective memory? Both types of collaboration increase the overlap in memories relative to no collaboration. But interestingly, being in insular groups and talking to the same people over and over again leads to more forgetting that is matched across people. So we have collective forgetting promoted by insular collaboration. Now, in this next study, we implement the same structure for the groups, identical and reconfigured groups, but now we are also manipulating who knows what within each groups. So the shared members are those who share some information where everyone had seen that information before. In the partially shared condition, only 2 group members saw some of the information before, the third one didn't. And in the unshared condition, only 1 person saw some of the information, but the others didn't. Why are we doing it? Because it allows a way to introduce false memories in this social network structure where not everybody knows everything, but when people contribute their recall, they do it very confidently because that particular person had actually seen that information. So the question is, can they inject that into the memories of others under these conditions? We also happen to manipulate the valence of information that they saw. As I mentioned to Amit earlier, I just wanted to connect with his talk a little bit by bringing some data that speak to emotional information. There was positive information, neutral, and negative information presented to the subjects. This is culture specific, of course, because what is neutral and what is valence changes according to culture. And I wanted to make that point. Okay, this is a slide with a number of graphs, but it can be actually simplified very quickly. Here we have collective memory for shared information. Here we have collective memory for partially shared information. And here we have collective false memory. The red bars are negative information, bluish gray bars neutral, and green bars positive information. The darker bars are items that were collectively remembered, and the paler bars are items that were collectively forgotten. And the sum and substance of the findings that I want to note for today's talk is that identical groups differ from diverse groups in the following way. In identical groups where there's insular collaboration, we have people showing more collective remembering and more collective remembering for negative information, and more collective forgetting, particularly for positive information. Furthermore, insular groups also show more collective false memories. So in general, being in insular groups has very specific effects that are different from being in diverse groups when recalling the past. And then I want to talk a little bit about the contagion that we observed in a final recognition memory task we gave subjects, where everyone is doing this task alone, looking at what they had studied and information they had not studied. And the question is, does recognition memory change as a result of the type of reconfigured or identical groups in which people had participated earlier? And what we find is that indeed, false contagion increases, reports of false memory increase if one had been in diverse groups, because there's more exposure to different false memories in these groups. However, even though insular groups show less false memory, they're much more confident in those false memories as having been true because they have repeatedly heard this information. So again, the nature, the exposure to the same or different partners can change how memories change. Marina, can you give me an indication of where we are with time?
Yeah, you have at least 5 or 6 minutes more.
Thank you. Thank you. So That's with reference to how memories change with respect to content. Now I want to switch to a related consequence, which is, while social transmission of information changes what people remember, does it also change the way people organize their retrieval? And as I mentioned at the outset, how we organize information has far-reaching consequences, as we know from research on individual memory, because organization of memory guides both remembering and new learning. So given that, can others influence how we organize our memories? And by implication, what consequences that has for how we retrieve the past and how we approach the future? So now we can ask this question at three levels, looking at the structure of individual memory following collaboration. So compare baseline with final individual recall, or compare those who never collaborated earlier with those who collaborated. We can also look at the structure of group recall. During collaboration, is the sequence of recall disrupted by being in groups? And there we can right away assume that it should be. That's part of the disruptive process that I discussed with you earlier that leads to lowering recall in groups. And then there's the structure of collective memory. That is, after having been in groups, when people recall information, now working alone, is the pattern of their recall, is the sequence in their recall now taken on a form where former group members are exhibiting similar retrieval patterns. So not just the similar content, but also similar organization. So those are the three ways that at least we can ask this question. In individual memory research, in individual recall research, there is a long history of measuring organization in different ways. There's semantic contiguity, there's temporal contiguity, and then there's paired frequency measure. I'm going to talk about two of them very briefly. Semantic contiguity is where we have meaningfully related information clustering together, such as category information. It can also be valence information. And adjusted ratio of clustering is typically used to measure this. So here you can see participant 1 has more category clustering. Here are animals and here are vehicles in their recall. Participant 2 has less categorical structure or less semantically organized items. So this is one measure of organizing, of measuring this recall structure. Another would be what is known as subjective organization, where it's not so much that information is related through some objective measures that we have gathered through our norming, but people have a propensity to organize information. So even when given unrelated information, people exhibit a particular pattern. And if we give them multiple recalls, they'll continue to exhibit that pattern, even honing in on that pattern. So here you can see that from first recall to second recall, cherry and wrench go together, but sweater and jeep that occur on both recalls are not clustered together. So you can have the same content, but not the same clustering. And this is subjective organization. Its advantage is that it can be used even for unrelated information, which goes to show how strong the propensity is for people to organize information. Okay, so now we have both types of organization, two types of organization from individual recall that we can apply to understanding its consequences in group recall. So here's again back to our normal flow that I have talked to you about. This is the nominal group that will give us the baseline because there was no collaboration. And here's the group that will collaborate. So first we have individual recall, then group recall, and then individual recall, giving us baseline and post-collaborative measures. And then we can ask about structure of memory at the baseline, and then during group recall and during socially modified individual memory, right? So there's evidence to show that indeed when we apply these organizational measures, people show disrupted group recall. And we can also implement measures to mitigate the destruction of this organization. For example, by having people do individual recall repeatedly before they enter groups, so they have secured their organization. So when they go into groups, they are less disrupted. And actually that also ameliorates the reduction in memory loss. And then we can also measure from first to the third recall or second to the third recall the influence of collaboration by looking at the final individual organization. And here the bottom line is people are most affected by the most recent collaboration in terms of how they organize their memories. And that's very interesting because here recency trumps over primacy, which is not the standard memory principle, as we know. So these are the ways in which we can look at structure of memory. But what about structure of collective memory? And this is my last point that I want to make in my talk. Can we see overlap in the structure of individual recall that occurs afterwards to see if people have acquired similar structures? So here we developed a measure that we call shared organization metric analysis, or SOMA. And the pun is intended here, where we flip the paired frequency measure by using, instead of recall 1 and recall 2 matching, we match across partners in their final recall to see whether they have similar structure in their recall output. So by using this measure, I want to show you two examples. On the left is an in-person lab experiment. On the right is an online remote experiment. And here we see that under a variety of conditions, when people collaborate, they show greater overlap afterwards in the way they organize their information, demonstrating collective memory structures that result from social interactions. And here we see that this can happen whether collaboration occurs early in sequence, late in sequence, multiple times. And this effect even persists 1 week later when we measure it. And this is these are the dark bars here. So what I have shared with you today are what we call the cognitive building blocks of collaborative remembering and emergence of collective memory. In doing so, looking at its influence not only on what we remember, but how we organize our memories. So let me thank all the organizers for this wonderful workshop, and Rob for inviting me to join. And of course, I want to acknowledge the support I have for this work and my amazing student and faculty collaborators who made this work possible. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Suparna. And I would want to invite anyone who has questions about Suparna's research to ask them. And I see a couple, at least one question by Ying in the chat. And yeah, Ying, do you want to start? And Celia would go next.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's a very interesting experiment, and I've learned a lot of details about the techniques. I'm not very familiar with the literature. I'm just curious because memory, there's a lot of things influence memory. For instance, my questions about the gender, for instance, the collaborative group, what is the gender balance? Are they all male, all female? What is proportion? And you talk about insert the face memory because of gender difference, whether male tend to insert the face memory more successful than the female. And the last quick question is about the emotion. So I really like you have positive, neutral, and negative pictures. But I think the memory literature also mentioned individuals' emotion feelings can also enhance the memory. So if you're extremely happy, extremely sad, you tend to remember things better. So those are some of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are great questions. Our groups are randomly formed with respect to nearly any demographic information that we might consider. I definitely recognize the point about gender. I think it also applies to many underrepresented individuals who might participate in groups. And actually, we have one study on gender with respect to, well, we control for gender rather than manipulate it, because we recognized the importance of it, because that's on collaborative learning of statistical concepts. But we do have one study where we have majority and minority members in groups. Three white American versus one group consisting of one white, one Asian, and one African American member. And what we find is in collaborative recall, a pattern of stereotype threat where African American individuals do just as everybody else when they're not in a group, but show lower performance in groups. So I think that speaks to the question that you're asking. That paper has come out in the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition, and I can send you the reference if you're interested. With respect to your second question on emotional memory, where it's not only the valence of the information we as experimenters present to the subjects, but rather the valence that the subject brings to the situation. So we don't have, I am not aware of research in this particular paradigm, but your point is very well taken, that definitely has an influence on memory. What we do have is some data that's somewhat speak to this issue. I think you can see how it relates, and that is autobiographical memories that are the people's own memories rather than what we are introducing in the lab. So we had subjects come into the lab after taking an exam. And if you've done well in the exam, you're feeling pretty good about it. Or if you think you've done well in the exam, you're feeling pretty good about it. If you haven't done well, you are not feeling so good about it. And so we had them recall their exam experience, and we coded that for valence. And had them collaborate or not collaborate. And what we found was that a pattern that's actually different from the pattern when we present information as we did in this experiment. This is something that we've been very intrigued by, which is that people after collaboration have less negative valence in their post-collaborative recounting. So it's sort of like, I don't know if this saying is common in all cultures, that if you share happiness, it doubles, and if you share pain, you can halve it. So it's one of those situations where after collaboration, people show less negativity in their reports. So I think that sort of speaks somewhat, I hope, to the question you're asking about what about people's own subjective valence in these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think that's very interesting finding, and I really like how you use the exam to, code the valence. I think through social interactions, I feel it's almost like a healing process. And in your study, after multiple collaboration, I was also wondering whether that's a novelty of keep meeting new peoples, and that kind of excitement boosts your memory, but I don't know.
That's a great question. I don't have data to speak to that, but I have an anecdote, if I may share that. Participants actually did not like it when we changed their groups. Every now and then they would say, why? They get to be in the same group. Why do I have to go to a different group? So it's actually the homophily starts to bring very quickly too. But I think what you're asking is an empirical question, and certainly something to look into.
Thank you so much for your answer and great research. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. I think we still have time for Celia's question. Celia, you're muted.
Thank you. I'll make it quick and following on from the last one, which is about chronic effects. The same group coming together repeatedly.
I'm sorry, I'm not getting this audio very well.
Have an effect on? I'll try speaking more slowly, and if that doesn't work, I'll give up. Is it better now? My screen is frozen. I will give up. Sorry.
Celia, would you like to just type your question in chat so that we have it and then I can get to it later, perhaps?
Yeah, that would be perfect. And I remember we had a question from Sudeep, so maybe you want to jump in and...
Yeah, I'm happy to ask if there's time. So yeah, great talk, Suparna. I was wondering how the composition of the list that people are remembering influences these interactions. Maybe you briefly talked about it, but I can imagine, for example, a list that's largely homogeneous in terms of sort of the semantic properties of the words, like isn't really sensitive to differences in semantic organization across people, and therefore you won't get like all these interaction effects. On the other hand, lists that have like all sorts of diverse objects and concepts. I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
No, that's a great question. And I think so much of this disruption effect rides on how similar or dissimilar information is that people are exposed to, because that's what they are organizing for themselves. We don't have evidence on this, but there is paper out in the literature. I believe it's by Basden and their group, where they manipulated the extent of category size, large versus small categories. So the more we diversify, the more there is need to impose a structure, the more disruptive collaboration is. But if the stimuli are easy to organize into categories, then it's easy to just, take one cue and get into the category. And if it's a small category, you get all the answers. So to your point, yes, list composition can have an impact. We ourselves have used mostly categorized lists or unrelated lists, and we are attracted. Unrelated lists are, of course, have the least ecological validity, but at the same time, they afford amazing theoretical weight, because they can help us pick up propensities that are so fundamental that those propensities operate even when information starts to get more and more ecological. And the question is, can the two override each other? So for that reason, we've used those two stimuli. But like I said, we've also used narratives in order to get at these questions, and some statistical descriptive questions to get at some of the more applied. But I hope that answers your question about the list. Yeah, the list structure matters.
Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. Thanks.
Great. Thanks everyone for this great discussion. And now it's time to turn to Amit's talk.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. That was really interesting, and you cannot, not think of the sort of political consequences of this kind of balanced information that you described. It's just really remarkable, especially given everything is going on. But maybe we can talk about that later. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to present my work. I really enjoyed these sessions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And I want to thank the organizers, Mirta, Robert, and Marina, for thinking about me and for organizing this group. We talked a lot about intelligence, and today about memory, and somewhat unexamined sort of aspect of intelligence involves emotion. And so looking at previous lectures, I thought it would be good to start by sort of talking a little bit about what makes collectives emotional. And just a background, so I grew up in Israel and moved to the US for grad school. And Israel has a very different emotional tone than the US. Basically, it feels like everything is like a simmering pot of emotion. And it's true for everything from the way people drive to the way they stand in lines. If they stand in lines, but especially relevant to the political domain, in which it feels like every small event lead the whole system into an explosion, an emotional explosion. We Israelis who kind of live abroad are sometimes joking that we were ahead of our times, because it now seems like in the US, we're more or less in the same situation in which we're constantly feeling like we're in the middle of some emotional storm. And so the question that I'm hoping to ask with you today is, what are the processes that contribute to increases of collective emotion? And I define collective emotion as some macro level affective state that can be seen when we summarize multiple emotional expressions over time. And I want to sidestep the philosophical question of whether groups have or don't have emotions. There's really interesting work on this kind of question by philosophers like Bryce Hubner and Dennett, but I merely want to say that sort of looking at the collective emotion gives us something interesting that we can't really see at the individual level. And let me give you an example. So these are all the tweets that were produced in response to the Ferguson unrest, which was the first event that basically initiated the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we're looking at millions and millions of tweets that were produced in a period of 4 months. And if we average the negative emotional intensity of those tweets, we see that they start very negative, and negativity sort of calms down a little bit, but it picks up again in September. Now, this is the collective level. If we look at negative intensity per tweet number, so now we look at the individual level. So if I wrote 5 tweets, what is the emotional intensity of my tweets comparing my first tweet to my 5th tweet? And we find that actually, not surprisingly, people are sort of habituating to the process. So the point of these 2 graphs is to show you that sort of at the individual level, there's sort of behavior that we should expect from individuals who are tweeting on the same subject, which is they generally calm down a little bit. But at the collective level, the system is sort of fluctuates in a really different way. And it's picking up in September, mainly as a result of sort of the bubble of people tweeting about Black Lives Matter expanding in a rate that is sort of more higher than the rate of decay, basically. So going back to the question, what are the processes that contribute to increases of collective emotion? I want to start by the end and tell you what I think, why I think this question is important. And the first answer to this question is prediction. I think that the same way that we can predict, or that we want to predict, whether an individual will have a psychotic breakdown or will try to commit suicide based on their previous behavior, it would be really important and interesting if we can learn collective behavior and sort of try to predict what would happen. And there's a few ways to think about prediction when it comes to collective emotion. The first is sort of brute force machine learning, applying a lot of data and trying to predict sort of collective behavior, let's say on social media, and we have some work on that. And the other ways are sort of more to sort of understand the underlying processes, either by using modeling or by doing some experiments. And I'm gonna review some experiments today. But that's the first goal. And if we can predict whether groups are gonna sort of lose control and maybe in some cases be violent or behave in ways that we sort of don't want to see, maybe there's ways in which we can find to regulate these groups in cases in which they lose control. And that's sort of the second reason why this question is interesting. And there's a reason why there's no citations here. There's basically almost no research on, there's a lot of research on how to regulate individuals' emotions, but not a lot on sort of regulating collective emotion. And we're doing some work in this space as well. Okay. So I want to sort of introduce you to the way that I'm thinking about what makes collectives emotional, and I want to start with emotional interactions, and that's sort of the most obvious. When researchers and modelers and people sort of think about what makes collectives emotional, they mostly think about collective sort of emotional interaction between people, and most specifically emotion contagion. So by contagion, I mean, let's assume that a person in a network has a certain emotional response, and the idea that that response is more likely to be spreading to other people on that network. And if we have some kind of a time course and we look at intensity, time course will look more intense sort of on average, it will look more intense than if these people were not interacting with each other. So that's kind of the most obvious thing that you can say on sort of what makes collective emotion. And we've done much of my dissertation work was on sort of how emotion contagion lead to sort of amplification. And we recently wrote a text review on that. So if that's something that is interesting to you, you're welcome to take a look. But what I'm hoping to talk about today is two things that are sort of a little less obvious, two less obvious processes that contributes to groups becoming more emotional. The first one is perception. And the idea is that what if our perception of what other feels is inaccurate, such that we tend to think that people are expressing stronger emotions than they actually do? If that's the case, then when we're converging on some collective emotion in a process of contagion, we're actually converging to an emotion that is higher in essence than it actually is, which contributes to an increase in collective emotion. So that's the first idea that I'm hoping to explore. The second thing, and this is sort of part of a cyclical model, is the idea that emotional interactions are occurring within a certain infrastructure, network infrastructure. But the network infrastructure is not static, but is actually impacted by how people react to each other's emotion. And that's the second thing that I'm hoping to explore. And I should say that this sort of cyclical model is highly influenced by a paper that Mirta recently wrote in 2021. Similar idea, but sort of thinking about cognition. So today I'm going to show you some empirical evidence for the two least obvious sort of connections between how our interactions influence our perception and how our interactions influence our social infrastructure. So let's start with perception. So in general, when we're thinking about how do people aggregate sort of collective information, one literature that has focused on this question is the ensemble coding literature. And the ensemble coding literature makes a really sort of simple idea, which is in order to understand our world, who's very complex, people sort of form summary statistics. Particularly, they're sensitive to the averages of collective information. And this is sort of an idea that was already introduced by Aristotle and was sort of one of the central tenets of this sort of Gestalt psychology. And we experimental psychologists have taken these interesting ideas and made them into really boring experimental paradigms in which we force people to look at textures, motions, sizes, and orientations, and sort of provide summaries of this. And one sort of part of ensemble coding literature is faces. And the general idea or the general argument that ensemble coding researchers make is that people are quite accurate in evaluating the emotions of a collective. And this always felt wrong to me because we know that people have a limited capacity to the amount of faces, let's say, they can look at a crowd. And ensemble coding literature sort of sometimes suggests sort of a square root of n. But this is obviously relates to the experiments in which people are shown, 20 people on a screen. Obviously, the larger crowds, this doesn't work. But the point is that we have a limited capacity to the amount of faces that we can see in the crowd. And assuming that we have some preferential attention to emotional faces, my hypothesis was that if we're looking at a crowd, we're more likely to spend time looking at the emotional faces in the crowd. We're more likely to think that the crowd is more emotional than it actually is. So there should be a process of amplification. And there's a second prediction here, which is when you increase the size of the crowd, if you increase the sampling by a little bit, amplification should increase. So let me review these hypotheses more clearly. The first hypothesis is that people tend to amplify crowds. So the estimate of the crowd mean is higher than the actual mean. So if we assume a set size of 4 and we assume that the numbers indicate salience, so if I'm subsampling 2 out of these 4, so I'm taking the most salient ones here, then the average of the subsample will be higher than the actual average, which was 2.5. And I'm amplifying. And if we're increasing the number of faces from 4 to 8, and now again, I'm I'm subsampling a square root of 8, the subsample average will increase to 3.66. And this is related to sort of the collective memory idea, but given that people sort of pay more attention to negative emotions compared to positive emotions, there is an idea that sort of amplification will be stronger for negative emotions. So how do we test that question? So what we did was we took a neutral facial expression and an emotional facial expression and created 50 morphs that represents sort of a scale of sort of 1 to 50 of degrees of emotional intensity. We did this for anger and for happiness. And then we took each face and we had raters rate the emotional intensity of that face on a 1 to 50 scale. And then we made sure that that face was similar to the morph that we created. So now we have an objective value for each of these faces of how do people on average evaluate the emotional intensity of that face. And we did this for a variety of different identities. In the actual task, participants see a crowd. In this case, the crowd is kind of uniform. So it's the same identity, but different intensity. And the reason why we did this in the first studies was because we didn't want that people would sort of look at the others that they think they're more attractive. We wanted sort of the identity to be identical, but we've changed that quite a bit in the past few years. But basically, they see 1 to 12 faces expressing either positive or negative, but not both. So either the crowd is either neutral to positive or neutral to negative. And the mean of that crowd is there's a uniform distribution. After participants see the crowd, they're asked to move the mouse to the left of the line, and then to estimate the average emotion of the crowd by morphing that face to fit with what they think is the crowd mean. So as you can see, the face kind of changes when they move their mouse. Okay, so here on the x-axis, there's the number of faces that they saw on the crowd, so 1 to 12 faces. And the y-axis is the difference between the actual mean and the estimated mean. And what we see, generally speaking, is that two things. On average, people tend to amplify the crowd. So they tend to think that the crowd is expressing stronger emotion than it actually is, and that increases with the size of the crowd. And we've done this experiment a lot of times, and it sometimes looks, but generally it's a linear increasing trend. We also see that there's a slight increased amplification for negative emotions compared to positive, but it's very small, actually. We did this task with an eye tracking and sort of measured dwell time on these faces. And actually, people do sort of fixate on 3 of the 12 faces. So the square root of n kind of back of the envelope is actually true here. And we had a hypothesis that maybe people kind of look at the crowd and then they attach to these sort of more emotional crowd members, but that turned out to be actually wrong. What we did find was that people actually randomly scanned the crowd but got stuck on the emotional faces. And any of us who sort of ever give a talk in a conference can sort of relate to that experience when our faces get stuck on that kind of angry face in the crowd that doesn't like our talk and sort of taints our old memory of what the crowd feels. So basically, that's what we find. We've since then did a bunch of work on this idea. A lot of our exposure to collective information comes sequentially rather than in a collective. And recently a published paper in Nature Human Behavior showing that the same thing happens when people are evaluated emotions over time, either in videos or in through like a feed-like situation. And obviously the composition of the crowd matters. So for example, people tend to, this amplification effect increases when the proportion of black faces in the crowd increases, or when the proportion of angry women in the crowd increases, actually. Okay, so emotional interactions influence our perception of these interactions, but our perceptions are inaccurate. and we tend to think that the collective is actually more emotional, and we converge to a more emotional collective emotion, which in turn increases the collective emotion. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that our interactions influence the infrastructure that we're part of. So most of the models of collective emotion assume a fixed infrastructure, but our infrastructure change a lot as a function of who we interact with, especially when we're thinking of interactions on social media. So let me give you an example of how this plays out. So let's assume that we have a network that responds to a case of police brutality against sort of a Black demonstrator. And we have one person in this network who's sort of unhappy by this interaction. And they see another person in their network who's also unhappy, and they're sort of rewarding them for this unhappiness. So merely by interacting with this person, at least on social media, that means that these two people are going to see each other more. So the network has already shifted so that these people are sort of more closely tied to each other. There's another person who's really angry. They're getting multiple rewards for their sort of anger, again, increasing the tie. Yet there's a third or a fourth person in this network who are sort of ambivalent or sort of doesn't know what they feel about this, or actually think it's not a big deal. And merely by the fact that these people are not engaging with that person, or maybe even blocking that person, or the network is sort of slowly shifting to sort of increase ties of people who think alike and sort of decrease ties of people who don't think alike. And that's sort of, there's a lot of work on this sort of contributing to an echo chamber occurrence and segregation and so on and so forth. But that's not the really cool thing. That's sort of kind of, or a little bit known. So one question is, what is the social tie selection strategy that people use when they choose social ties based on their emotional expressions? So let's assume that you are located on some kind of an emotional spectrum, and these are all of your potential ties, okay? And the most obvious process that was alluded in the previous talk as well is sort of the tendency to homophilize, meaning choosing to keep the people who are closer to the individual in terms of their emotional responses. But what if what we actually see in terms of tie selection leads to an even more extreme dynamic of segregation? And we hypothesized that the strategy that people use when selecting social ties is actually what we call acrophily, or at least in some part acrophily. And acrophily is the tendency of individuals to associate and bond with people who hold more extreme views than their own view. So if I have two people on my side that have equal distance in terms of their distance to me, a homophily theory would not make any prediction regarding which one I'm going to choose. But in an acrophily world, I'm going to be more likely to choose the people who express a more extreme view, in this case, a lot of emotion. And obviously, I'm not trying to go against homophily. That would be ridiculous. So the idea is that people sort of do some kind of a mix between homophily and acrophily and sort of unequally sample from the extreme rather than the moderate. So let me show you how we test that in a task. This is something that is really hard to test. So we had a task in which participants saw pictures of police brutality against Black demonstrators, and were asked to first provide a text response to the picture, as well as rate their negative emotions to the picture. So 1 to 9, 1 is neutral, 9 is very negative. And the reason why we didn't have positive here is that even people who are very conservative don't really conceive this as a positive picture. After rating the picture, participants see these are 6 agents who are basically responding to the same picture. These are real responses that we've collected initially, and the picture have a name, a text response, and a rating. And our participants are asked to do the following. They're asked, in this case, to eliminate the people that they don't want to see in the next trial. So in this case, I'm eliminating 3 people that I don't wish to see. Now, they go through another trial. They again see another picture, they provide a rating, they provide a response, and again see 3 responses, but now 3 of those are kept from previous trials. So participants are choosing who they want to keep seeing, and 3 of them are sort of randomly generated from an MTurk sample that we've initially created. So what we have here is a task in which people 20 times sort of slowly curate who they want to see in their social network. And the question is, what is the strategy that people use to curate their social network? So we ran multiple studies on this paper, was sort of about to come out in Nature Human Behavior as well. And in this case, I'm going to show you 400 participants. Half of them are liberal, half of them are conservatives, and they're choosing from a peer network of that is also sort of balanced. And what I'm hoping to show you in terms of the results is we have participants' ratings, the average ratings of the people they chose to keep, and the average ratings of the people they chose to eliminate. So let's start with our liberal. So our participants on the green line are selecting to keep people, that's the red line, who are on average expressing stronger emotions in response to these police brutality pictures than their own emotions. So in other words, the average of the people that they're choosing is more extreme than their own ratings, whereas the people they eliminate are sort of less strong. What liberals do is the exact opposite. Liberals choose people who rate less negatively, so representing a more extreme view of their own view compared to their own, and eliminating people who are more emotional than them. So in other words, both liberals and conservatives in this case are acrophylizing on average, meaning choosing peers who are more extreme than their own, or represent a more extreme view of their own, and this is kind of constant over time. We've started to look at acrophily occurring on social media. This is data from a paper that was written recently in PNIS by Tamara van der Doss and Mirta and others. They basically took 3,000 tweets and asked raters to evaluate the tweet, the person who wrote the tweet political affiliation, as well as there's the rater's political affiliation, there's the rater's estimation of the political affiliation of the user who wrote a specific tweet, and whether they like the tweet or not. So here again, we're analyzing sort of existing data, and on the y-axis is whether they like that tweet, and on the x-axis is whether they evaluated this tweet to be moderate or extreme of their own political group. And what we see, both when we look at the overall group, as well as when we look at just people who consider themselves as moderates, that more extreme tweets evaluated by the users are liked more. So this is another evidence of sort of people seeking or interested in sort of extreme views. Okay, so just to summarize, I was trying to, my sort of in this talk, sort of try to give you a little bit of an overview of the question of what makes collective emotional. And I wanted to sort of expand our understanding of sort of processes that contribute to amplification and collective emotion, from interactions to how we perceive these interactions, and how our infrastructure sort of affecting and is affected by our interactions. This is sort of a shameless plug, or I think this is a community that would be interested in this. We're organizing Mirta and me and a bunch of other people are organizing a pre-conference on collective psychology in SPSP. So even if you're not a social psychologist or not interested in psychology, but interested in collective psychology, this is online, and I highly sort of welcome you to join us. And I also want to thank my collaborators on these sort of 2 projects that I presented, and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Amit. And I would want to invite anyone who has questions specific to Amit's talk, or especially bridging Suparna's talk and Amit's talk. Anyone who has any thoughts or questions, please raise your hand. And I can maybe start with a question for Amit. My question is, what are the limits of emotion amplification? So basically, given what you have been suggesting, we kind of constantly amplify our own emotions by looking at more emotional people or by cutting the connections with people who express less emotional responses. So, and the question is, when does this stop? It doesn't mean that the group will constantly amplify until they reach the most emotional stage possible, or what are the other constraints that play out there?
Yeah, so this is a really important point. Thank you for asking this question. So generally speaking, emotions are sort of short-lived experiences, meaning you have an emotion and it sort of exponentially decays over time. And so the general tendency of the system is sort of to gravitate towards equilibrium. And so I should have maybe started with that and to say that generally speaking, emotional systems tend to sort of have a peak and then quickly decay. And the question is, what are the processes that are kind of extend that peak? Now, there's a really interesting, there are some interesting situations, such as the Ferguson unrest or George Floyd or other sort of unique events that lead to not like a little bit of an increase, but rather sort of resonance that sort of extends for like a long period of time. And one really interesting question is, what can predict these types of processes? And that's a question that is very hard to answer. Some people claim it's random. Some people claim it's sort of merely up to the events. So, George Floyd, for example, is 7-minute video of police brutality that is very obvious. And so that's kind of elicits a lot of collective emotion. But there's clearly some things that, but on the other hand, Ferguson did not have any visual representation, and yet led to sort of months and months of activation. And we're exploring that. There's some interesting things that occur as a result of a system responding to the same event over time. In this case, Black Lives Matter, which leads to the fact that more connections are formed between people who write tweets on Black Lives Matter, which leads to an increased variance because of increased autocorrelation between the people in the group, which makes the system sort of less stable from a complex system kind of dimension. But the general idea is that people tend to calm down really quickly. And actually, in most cases, collective emotion actually dies out really fast. But the question is, what are some of the processes that contribute to its increase, and how can we predict dynamics that it will sort of extend the emotionality even further? Yeah. Rob?
Yeah. So this is mostly a question for Amit, but I think it also loops in Suparna. And this is asking you to so maybe talk a little bit about what you said you didn't want to talk about, sort of the Bryce Hubner kind of macro mind. And this from the context of when I hear the word collective emotion among social psychologists, I always think it means like the emotion of the collective, of the group. And that's not usually what they mean. They usually mean asset cashes out in the individuals. And so where it loops into what Suparna was talking about is like in a lot of her experiments, the final stage is individual recall as well, rather than the group. And so I'm just wondering kind of like whether you think that the collective could have an emotion that doesn't sort of reduce to the aggregate emotions of the individuals and what it would look like. Because I can sort of imagine like Apple being afraid of being slapped with an antitrust suit, even though Steve Cook isn't particularly afraid of it, or maybe nobody in Apple is. So I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking about, is sort of maybe this reaction against the sort of reduction to the individual.
Yeah. Thank you. So let me start. Sorry, and then I'll let you, Suparna, to sort of take if that's okay with you. Okay, great. So I think about this all the time, basically, and I completely agree that it's sort of as psychologists, social psychologists, we study social groups, but we tend to sort of really strongly gravitate towards the individuals. This notion of sort of a collective having an emotion and what does that mean is a really interesting sort of a question. So, in philosophy, so let me start with the philosophers. The philosophers seems to think that it's sort of crucial for a collective to have consciousness, for it to have an emotion, or at least Dennett, that's what Dennett kind of tend to think. I think Bryce has kind of an interesting, and so the question is, are you willing to argue that groups have consciousness or not, and whether this is a necessary condition for you? And there's a whole sort of space of really interesting sort of philosophical debate on that I'm gonna elegantly yet try to avoid here. But I will say something about, so I do think that there's something about the emotion, the macro level phenomena here that can be reduced, or that by reducing it, you're just missing the whole thing. So I try to give that example of sort of collective emotion going down and then picking up again. That's not something that you can see at all at the individual level, because what you need to think of a collective as sort of an entity that is in some ways evolves over time, and the what's considered the collective size network is evolving, which leads to the change in collective emotion. There's just no way that you can capture that if you look at individual emotional responses. And that's, I think, what we mean when we say Apple is afraid. Yeah, maybe if you like survey employees of Apple and ask them if they're afraid, you get like really low response. But actually, if you look at the behavior of the collective as an entity, it does seem like it's afraid or angry or so on and so forth. And so not looking at that level is kind of really a shame, except for, especially when you're thinking of collective phenomena. I do think that there's something about there, and this is sort of an insight, that there is something different in the, even if you do reduce it to the individual level, there is something very different in the experience of one experiencing emotion and one experiencing emotion with the notion that it's kind of us that are experiencing it together. If you're a CEO of a company that is abusing its employees, but they don't know each other, they don't know that they're being, so like a cell phone company that's sort of overpriced, but the clients don't know, you have a very different problem than when the employees are angry, but they know that other people are angry. And so I think even if you disagree to the notion that in like some deep philosophical sense, groups have emotions, it makes total sense to just look at that level, because you can get a lot of information. That's my response.
Should I jump in at this point? I mean, Amit's response was both really truly comprehensive and really touches on a number of key points about this issue that, I completely, I resonate with this. As someone who is looking at these questions and experiments, Rob, I'm asking myself this last point that Amit pointed out. The collective representation of memory in my experiments, in these experiments, is really the overlap, right? It's the shared information across these individuals. The key question is, are they aware or not aware that they share this information with others? So in our experiments, the individuals are not aware. We are just doing this after they've done their individual recall, left the lab. But a lot of the knowledge and emotion that we might consider at the collective level, as it translates into some sort of action, often comes from not just shared representation, but shared knowledge that the other person has the same emotion or has the same information, right? So those are two different levels of analysis and potentially have different consequences for what Apple as a company might or might not do, or what the customers of a was it a phone company that or internet provider that Amit you mentioned. I've already done false memory on this and distorted it. How the customers would act when they are aware of this shared knowledge versus when they have shared knowledge but they're not aware of it. And this could connect to some of the work that Steve Sloman is doing.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for excellent discussion. I want to follow up on this recent line of thoughts that you expressed. So I guess my question is, if we want to go to this higher level and take it seriously as a group having memory or group potentially having emotions, given that psychologists have already spent at least a century or even more studying these processes at the individual level, are there particular mechanisms or concepts or tools that you think would be useful in transferring from individual to the study of group processes such as emotion or memory? And what would this be?
Go ahead, Amit.
I'm happy to. Okay, so this is a fantastic question. So okay, so I think this is me being kind of maybe hopeful, but I think we are entering into sort of an era of collective psychology, collective behavior, for a few reasons. One, it's much easier to have people interact in experimental paradigms these days. There's at least 5 or 6 platforms that are sort of easy to use, in which you can bring people online who are like MTurk users to do things online and to sort of interact naturally and aggregate their information. So it's cheaper and it's easier from a technical perspective to do these studies, which means that there should be more and more collective psychology or collective behavior experiments, and there are. Second, there is a lot of collective behavior data that is readily available to us from social media, from internet forums, from companies, from sort of behavior phone data that sort of makes things really easy to evaluate. And so one thing that you can look at, for example, okay, that you couldn't do 5 years ago is, let's look at all the tweets that were generated on Black Lives Matter and see how the emotional responses have changed over time. And then let's try to build models that would try to replicate these. So I think that's a second. The third is sort of like a sociology of science, which is that places like Santa Fe Institute, complex system centers at Kellogg, who've never had psychologists in them. They always have physicists and biologists and sometimes economists, but never psychologists, are starting to sort of introduce to the idea that, okay, so there could be sort of interesting translations on sort of individual psychology to these, or insight from psychology to these spaces. And so you see these connections are forming, and this is a really good example of that. So I think, I don't know if you asked a technical question, but sort of what's happening, but I think there's a lot to be hopeful for in terms of this sort of space, I think, in the next few years.
Right. So from my perspective, Maria, this is actually exactly the sort of question that's motivating a lot of what we are doing in the lab, but we are doing it from perhaps the opposite end of what Amit has been describing, where you have lots and lots of these collective level data that you can use. And here we are trying to really bring it down to these micro level analyses to say that, can we take it from the individual to the small group and then kind of build it up from there to see how these mechanisms either hold up or transform, or are just not even relevant when you start using, when you start to scale up. So Rob, to your question, I mean, one of the one of the Rob's question in the chat chat section about how to connect this to modeling, right? And I want to give a shout out to Willa, who I see somewhere on this panel, who's attempting something very similar, where take these theories that are built and these sophisticated theoretical work on individual level performance, and then see, can it scale up in a model by holding those very same mechanisms and accounting for them, and then identifying other mechanisms that emerge. So yeah, I think that I see as a historic arc in both building theory and phenomena. Great question from my perspective.
Yeah, I want to add, I just want to emphasize this. I think this is a really important point. Our sort of expertise in doing experiments and sort of transitioning slowly from these sort of microdynamics and then designing experiments exactly like, in which people sort of in small groups interact, and then expanding that and using agent-based modeling, sort of look at the broad level consequences, is really our huge, it's kind of like we're taking our expertise and sort of applying it to this space. And I think this is a really really important sort of place in which we can contribute to this sort of increasing effort to understanding collective psychology. I completely agree with that.
Great. We have Jim and then Art with thoughts or questions.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I guess this is a question for Amit, really, and the question per se is, have you tried this with positive emotions? Have you tried this in the positive realm? Because I'm interested in the differences in behavioral decision making between losses and gains. The attitudes are very different, and that's associated with negative emotions and positive emotions. And basically, negative emotions are much more powerful drivers of behavior and change than positive. So I wonder what you've found if you've played with that.
Yeah, so being interested in conflicts and collective action movements, I'm unfortunately spend most of my time looking at negative emotions. Well,
that may be fortunate.
Yeah, I could tell you that there's a classic work by I believe Fowler and Christakis looking at the spread of happiness in networks. This is not really emotions, it's more like affect and well-being, but this is a really fantastic kind of work that suggests that happiness spreads in networks. There is a lot of work, and I think that Suparna last point in her talk sort of mentioned that, which is that when people get together, they're just happier. And so there's really interesting work to be done on, and we're doing some work on sort of how can we use, one of the biggest problems, I think, is that people are not interacting enough with other people. They're lonely. They're sort of spend most of their time looking at their computers and interacting virtually and not sort of interacting. And one question is how can you increase that? What can we do to improve that? The last thing I wanted to say about social media is that in general, emotional content produced by social media tend to spread more. But this is more driven by negative emotion than positive emotion, which is a really a bummer. So it's clear that people are reacting to emotions, but they're more reacting to negative emotions. And the problem is that social media companies who basically want to increase engagement realize that this is kind of a really good way to keep people engaged. And so it's both the bottom-up sort of preference that is supported by sort of these top-down sort of algorithms. And one interesting question is, what can we do to make positive emotions spread more than negative emotions? And there's all sorts of really interesting work on that is starting, I think, these days on this question.
Yeah, and in fact, what you just described, Amit, about the spread of negative information and being much more prevalent and powerful is in our lab experiments that I described. That's sort of the consistent effect we found, which completely builds, Marina, to your point, on individual memory experiments where people remember negative information much more than there's a general valence effect, but it's much more powerful for negative information than for positive information. And in our insular groups, we consistently found that groups and individuals are reporting negative information more than any other valence. And that started to emerge in the collective memory domain as well. So that is, so that's sort of, taking Amit's example to circle back to your question about there's this real thread from, individual lab experiments all the way to how emotions are playing out in these large transmitting networks.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to note one thing related to Celia's point. There's a really interesting sort of philosophy by David Chalmers, the philosopher, on sort of weak and strong emergence that sort of feels very similar to sort of Celia's kind of distinction that I thought would be interesting. I also wanted to ask Suparna. Oh, sorry, Art. This is in relation to your point on sort of the negative being remembered more in sort of enclosed communities. It's just kind of a really interesting insight. Yeah. Sorry, Art.
But I think that's where the sorry, Art. I'll just add one point. Sure. I'll yield the floor if that's okay. That's why we found our results with autobiographical memory so interesting. So when it matters to people, at a personal level, and they're able to talk to someone else to whom it matters in a similar way, some of these patterns can start to shift. So I think that contrast between something we read on the news and the negative part just sticking and just making this landing versus how I deal with the events in my personal life and how I try to modulate and regulate the emotion associated with that, I think groups could have very different influences. That's what our data are suggesting. So yeah, Art, I yield the floor to you.
Well, thanks for two very interesting presentations. I want to identify a level that I consider discourse and communication in some of these collective emotions. And I think there is creating a narrative, and emotions are part of that, and recreating narratives or repeating them. Interestingly, I'm here in Memphis and we're celebrating Elvis Week, right? And some of people, this is in honor of his death, by the way. And there is a grievance point where everybody holds the lighter up. I wonder if all of them individually are really grieving. I bet you many aren't. They're just partaking in an event that's part of a narrative. And, it would be interesting to track the tweets around something like this. What do people talk about? What are the emotional dynamics over the course of this 8 days? And that might be in kind of a naturalistic way of tracking this. And it strikes me that there are other people who die or whatever, and you can track the memories, what they say, and their emotions over time. But I just wanted to ask whether this collective memory and emotions can be at all explained by the creation and reenactment of narratives.
So, Amit, shall I go?
Yeah.
Okay, so Art, great question. I think historians and anthropologists are particularly interested in the question that you asked. So if you look at some of the work by Jim Warsh, I think he is particularly interested in collective memory as a narrative for a people. So it's about, and that's where the whole notion of identity being tied to memory for a group becomes very salient. And anthropologists as well, they talk about approaching it in two different, as also sociologists. So I think in the social sciences, the notion of narratives has been very prevalent, partly because of the questions they're interested in, and partly because of the materials they use for their research. And I think that's something that is coming ever so slowly into at least the cognitive experimental area, about how some of what people do and some of what people want to be a part of is to be a part of a narrative, however less or more committed they might be to the act itself.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think we're out of.
Yeah, so great discussion, which can continue further in the Slack. And if anyone feels frustrated that they could not follow all the excellent comments in the chat, I'll be posting it in the Slack group as well. So please be there and keep updated on that. And thanks again, everyone, for showing up. And we'll meet again next week.
Marina, thank you for the
Thank you so
superb
much.
organization. It was very helpful.